Welcome to the final video in our series on the skeletal system. Today we'll cover the bones of the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton includes the appendages, so the arms and the legs, as well as the bones of the pectoral girdle that attach the arm to the body, and the pelvic girdle that attaches the legs to the body. So we'll start with the bones of the pectoral girdle. Those bones include the clavicle or collarbone, as well as the scapula or shoulder blade. Again, you can see that these bones form the shoulder joint or socket where the humerus or arm bone attaches. First, we'll look at the clavicle or collarbone. Okay, you see your clavicle here, your collarbone. The clavicle or collarbone is kind of an S-shaped flat bone. And when you look at it, you see that you have two curved ends. One of those ends is more flat than the other. One of them is more rounded and swollen, more blunt. The blunt end is called the sternal end. The sternal end. The sternal end will meet up with the sternum or the breastbone. Okay, so this would be the sternal end. Okay, the more rounded, swollen end. The flat end then is called the acromial end. Acromial. Okay, and you see here that the acromial end comes over and meets up with the acromion. Okay, this process on the scapula or shoulder blade. Okay, so this is the clavicle. This is the sternal end. This flat end is the acromial end. Okay, that brings us to the scapula or shoulder blade. Okay, looking at the scapula or the shoulder blade, we see that we have these two large processes here. Okay, a top upper process and then a lower process. The top upper process is called the acromion or the acromion process. Remember, the acromion meets up with the acromial end of the clavicle. Okay, so this is the acromion. This lower process here is called the coracoid process. Okay, the acromion, the coracoid process. Looking here, okay, we see this depression, okay, this kind of a groove. That's called the glenoid cavity. Okay, the glenoid cavity. And when we look at the humerus, okay, we see that the humerus, the arm bone, fits right into that glenoid cavity and articulates. Okay, that's what forms our shoulder. Looking at the scapula, okay, we see that on the back of it, we have this ridge, okay, this raised ridge that sticks out. That's called the spine of the scapula. Okay, and that's actually on your back. You can feel that on your back, a ridge that sticks out going from your shoulder inward towards your spine. Okay, and that's the spine of the scapula. Finally, when we're looking at the scapula, we see that we have a lateral border and a medial border. Okay, so that's just showing that you know the orientation of the scapula, which side is more lateral, which side is more medial. Okay, so looking at the scapula, it's very easy to see which side is which by looking at where the glenoid cavity is. Okay, remember that this is where your arm attaches, and your arm is going to attach on the lateral side of your body. Okay, your arms are lateral, they're towards the outside, they're not towards the middle of your body. Okay, so that means that where the glenoid cavity is, this side over here is the lateral border. Okay, that's the lateral border of the scapula. Then this other side is the medial border of the scapula. Okay, so that scapula would fit just like this. Okay, so that's it for the pectoral girdle. Okay, again, from there we go to the humerus, the bone of the upper arm. Okay, when we look at the arms, we see that we have, actually at this side, we have one big bone in the upper arm, and then we'll have two smaller bones in the forearm. Okay, again, the humerus, the bone of the upper arm, fits right into the glenoid cavity of the scapula, forming the shoulder joint. When we look at the top of the excuse me. When we look at the top of the humerus, we see that it has this big rounded portion called the head. Okay, just like your head is a big round part. Okay, the head. If we go down from the head, we have this rough portion right here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but this is a rough portion. That's called the deltoid tuberosity. Okay, whenever we see a tuberosity, it's going to be a roughened portion where we have something typically connecting to the bone. In this case, the deltoid tuberosity is where the deltoid muscle, this muscle right here, attaches to the humerus. Okay, so the head of the humerus, the deltoid tuberosity. If we look down here at the bottom part of the humerus, we see that we have multiple projections here, okay, multiple little processes sticking out where the humerus articulates with the bones of the forearm. We also see that we have two important fossa or depressions. We have a little small depression or groove right here in the front of the humerus, and around the back, we have a much bigger depression or groove. So how do we name these things? First, the processes. Right here, okay, this very round process, laterally on the outside, this is called the capitulum. Okay, just like the Capitol building in Washington has a round roof, the capitulum is round. Then we have this process right here called the trochlea. And the trochlea is shaped like a spool. Okay, it includes this whole section inside my fingers. Okay, it has this kind of big swollen part, then it comes in and it's thin, and then it comes out again. So this whole thing is the trochlea. And you can see we can follow it all the way around to the back. Okay, so this here and here is the trochlea. Right here is the capitulum. Those will become important when we look at the bones of the forearm. Okay, we'll see that they sit right around these processes and articulate. Okay, and that the ulna articulates with the trochlea, whereas the radius is going to articulate with the capitulum. Okay, so finally, the two fossa, okay, the two depressions. In the front of the humerus, this smaller depression that we see here is called the coronoid fossa. The coronoid fossa. In the back, the larger depression is the olecranon fossa. Okay? And again, when we look at how the ulna articulates with the humerus, we see that these processes of the ulna will fit right into those grooves. Okay? So the coronoid process will fit right into the coronoid fossa when you bend your arm. When you extend your arm fully, the olecranon process will fit right into the olecranon fossa. Okay? So that's it for the humerus. Okay? That brings us to the two bones, the smaller bones that are down in the forearm. So, if I could put these together appropriately, here we go. We see that the two bones of the forearm are the radius and the ulna. Okay, and they sit together just like this. Okay, they sit in little grooves and come together like this. Okay, we see that the ulna is the bone that has this U at the top of it. Okay, the ulna has a U at the top. That's how you know it's the ulna. The radius, on the other hand, has a circle on the top. Okay, a perfect circle. Remember, a radius is a geometric term. That means half this width of the circle. Okay, so the radius has a circle. We'll start with the radius. Looking at the radius on its own, this part that's got this perfect circle is the head of the radius. Then if we extend down to the very bottom of the radius, we see this little point, and that's the styloid process of the radius. Okay, remember, styloid process is a very pointy process, just like a stylus is a pointy object you use for a touch screen. Okay, this is the styloid process. Finally, if we go across from the styloid process, we have this groove. You see this nice little groove or indentation right there? That's the ulnar notch. Okay, the ulnar notch. We see that the ulna fits right into that ulnar notch, just like that. Okay, you see at the bottom, the ulna right here fits right into that ulnar notch. Okay, just like that. So this is the radius, this is the head of the radius, this is the styloid process of the radius, this is the ulnar notch. This is the ulna. Again, it's got a big U on the top, U for ulna. Okay? If we look at the bottom of the ulna, we have another styloid process. Okay, so this is the styloid process of the ulna. Okay, another pointy end. If we go up to the top of the ulna, okay, again, we have this U that's made up of these two processes. The top process is the olecranon. Okay, the olecranon. Remember that fit right into the olecranon fossa. Okay. The bottom, smaller process is the coronoid process. The coronoid process that fits into the coronoid fossa. Finally, this middle section of the U, this notch or depression or hole that's right here, is called the trochlear notch. The trochlear notch. And again, it articulates with the trochlea, okay, with the trochlea of the humerus. Finally, when we're looking at the ulna, okay, right in from the trochlear notch, if we extend in, we have this little groove right here. Okay, you see this little groove, this little smooth depression? That's the radial notch. Okay, the radial notch, because that's where the radius sits. Okay, you see the radius sits right in that little radial notch. Okay, so this is the ulna with the U. The bottom of it, we have the styloid process of the ulna. At the top of it, we have the olecranon and the coronoid process, and in here, the trochlear notch. Finally, coming down from the trochlear notch, we have this little groove or depression called the radial notch. Okay, so that's the bones of the forearm. Okay, that brings us to the wrist. Okay, the bones of the wrist, which are called the carpal bones. Okay, each of these little square or boxy type bones, these are short bones. We have 8 carpal bones in each hand. You guys just need to know them as the carpals. They do have individual names, but for now, the carpals. Going out from the carpals into the bones of the hand, we have the metacarpals. Okay, we have 1 metacarpal for each finger. Okay, so the metacarpals. Then we go out to the smaller bones of the fingers, called the phalanges, or singular as a phalanx. So for each finger, we have 3 phalanges: the proximal phalanges, the middle phalanges, and the distal phalanges. Remember, distal are more distant from the body. Okay, they're the last phalanges. So we have 3 on each finger, except the thumb. On the thumb, we have 2 phalanges, a proximal phalange and a distal phalange. So don't get confused when you look at the thumb. Don't think that these 3 bones are all phalanges. This bottom bone here is a metacarpal bone. And then we have the proximal phalange and the distal phalange. So that's it for the upper extremities. That brings us down to the bones of the lower extremities and the pelvic girdle. So the pelvic girdle, or the pelvis, includes the bones, the hip bones, or coxal bones. They also called the os coxa. And we see that these coxal bones, the 2 of them will curve around to form the pubic symphysis, the joint in the center here, right under the pubis, or pubic bone. And then when we look around the back, we see that we have the sacrum, remember the sacrum from the bottom of the spine, that forms the back of the pelvis. So I'm going to get a pelvis all together here so that you guys can more easily see how the bones come together. Okay, So this shows us how those bones come together. We have the two coxal bones or hip bones, okay, joining up with the sacrum at the bottom of the spine. Again, this joint here is called the pubic symphysis. We have a cartilage pad in between the two bones. And this pubic symphysis is important because it does allow slight movement. This is an amphiarthrosis type of joint that allows slight expansion during childbirth as the infant is trying to squeeze through the birth canal. So looking at these bones, we see that there's actually 3 bones fused together to form the coxal bones. Those are the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So this top major large part is the ilium. Then as we extend it down here to the bottom back of each of these, that's the ischium. And this small front part is the pubis. So ilium, ischium, pubis. Okay? So then looking at the individual structures or parts of those bones, this top area up here is the iliac crest. If we go down from the iliac crest to the bottom of the ischium, we have this roughened portion on the bottom of the ischium. Remember I said that anything that's roughened is a tuberosity. So this is the ischial tuberosity, and that's your butt bone. Okay, when you sit down and you feel that bone stick out, the weight of your body is supported on this ischial tuberosity. Also, if we look on the sides here, we see this big large hole. That's the obturator foramen. And through this large hole, we have nerves leave the spinal cord and come pass down to go to the legs, as well as large blood vessels. So obturator foramen. Then these grooves, these little sockets here, are called acetabulum, A-C-E, acetabulum. And these are actually our hip joints. We'll see that the femur comes in, the head of the femur fits right into that socket to form your hip. Finally, right here, this little groove in between the sacrum and the ilium is the sacroiliac joint. The sacroiliac joint. And beneath the pubic symphysis, this angle right here is called the subpubic angle. And we can look at that subpubic angle to see if we're looking at a male or a female. A female is going to have an angle of about 100 degrees, whereas the male is going to be about 90 degrees. Finally, looking at the coxal bones themselves without the sacrum, we can see this bumpy area here. Okay, and that's the auricular surface. The auricular surface, A-U-R, okay, where the sacrum is going to fit in there. That brings us to the bones of the legs. The top bone in the leg, the big large bone, is the femur. Looking at the femur, we have this top rounded portion, which is the head, and then a thinner portion, which is the neck. And the neck is where the femur will typically break if it's going to break. The head of the femur and the neck. Then we have these swollen areas, a big swollen area here, and then around back, a smaller one. Those are trochanters. We have a greater trochanter, the big one, and a lesser trochanter, the small one. So the head, the neck, the greater trochanter, and the lesser trochanter. Going down to the bottom of the femur, we have these large swollen areas on the bottom, okay, and around towards the back of the femur. You see this large swollen bulb or ball almost. Those are called condyles. We have a medial condyle and a lateral condyle. When you're trying to figure out medial versus lateral, you can go up to the head. Remember that the head is where that hip's going to attach to the body. So that must be more medial. Following that down, this is the medial condyle. Coming over here from the greater trochanter on the outside, if we follow that down, that must be the lateral condyle. These condyles, we'll see, articulate with the condyles on the top of the tibia. This bone here is the tibia, the large bone in our lower leg. And if we put the tibia together with the femur, we see that we have the articulation of the knee. So looking at the bones in the lower leg, we have a tibia and a fibula. The tibia is bigger and shaped almost like a T. The fibula is small, just like a fib is a small little eye. When we're looking at the tibia, again, we have a medial condyle and a lateral condyle up top here. Okay, these grooves, swollen areas with a groove on top, where the femur sits. Trying to figure out which one is a medial and which one is lateral, we can come down to the bottom of the tibia and look at this swollen area. This is the malleolus, the medial malleolus. That's the medial bulge on the inside of your ankle. So going up from that medial malleolus, we'll follow that all the way up. That means this must be the medial condyle. And the other one is the lateral condyle. And you can see those grooves. Again, at the bottom, the medial malleolus. Up to the top of the tibia, the medial condyle and the lateral condyle. Finally, if we come right down from that area, we see these bumpy, kind of rough ridges here. This is the tibial tuberosity. The tibial tuberosity, and that's where the patellar ligament attaches. That brings us to the fibula. The fibula is the small, thin bone that's on the lateral or outer part of the leg, the lower leg. And the fibula is really, it's a small, rather weak bone. It doesn't support any of your weight. It's just there for muscle attachment. Looking at the fibula, it's kind of hard sometimes to see which part's the top or the bottom. The top of the fibula has this little notch here. You see that little notch that sticks up? Kind of a sharp little notch. That shows you that this is the top of the fibula. That means this must be the bottom. Okay? So the top of the fibula with this pointy little part is the head of the fibula. And then coming down to the bottom, this part that sticks out at the bottom is the lateral malleolus. So that's the bulge on the outside or the lateral side of your ankle. Finally, that brings us to the bones of the ankle and the feet. So our ankle bones, we actually have multiple bones that all together are known as the tarsal bones. The tarsal bones. There's two of the tarsal bones that I want you to know by name. The talus, this top one, the talus, and the calcaneus, this bottom one. The talus is important because as we see the tibia coming down, we see that it articulates perfectly with this talus. And then you can see how that forms the bulge on your ankle right here. So this is the talus, and then this bottom one is the calcaneus. Okay, and the calcaneus or calcaneus is your heel. That's your heel bone. Again, all together, these are the tarsal bones. Extending from the tarsal bones, the first bone for each of your toes is a metatarsal. Metatarsal. After the metatarsal bones, again we have phalanges, just like in the fingers. And just like in the fingers, we have 3 phalanges for each toe, a proximal, a middle, and a distal, except for the big toe. In the big toe, we only have 2 phalanges, a proximal and a distal. That sums up the lecture on the skeletal system. The next video that we'll cover will deal with the joints where our bones come together. And then after that, we'll go ahead and get into the muscles. Thank you so much.